In this video, I'm going to show you how I made a Lola nightlight for my kids. The first thing I did in making Lola was 3D print all the pieces. This model was designed by Droid Division. You can find the files over on the Droid Division Etsy shop. And I'll include a link in the video notes as well. All the parts were printed on an Ender 3 with some cheap white PLA from GST 3D. I sanded everything down with 80 grit sandpaper to knock down all the print lines, and then I glued up the legs and underside of the body using 2-part epoxy. To hide any seams, I just used some Bondo putty and sanded it down. Next up was the filler primer. I use this to help a bit more with the print lines, masking any scratches, smaller imperfections. And then I sand everything down with 120 grit and then 220 grit. And then I wet sand with 400 grit. With everything sanded, I did a quick dry fit of all the parts. In this clip, the main eye ring is actually upside down. No biggie, everything comes back apart for paint. Before painting, I hit everything with a quick coat of primer. For the upper half of the main body, I put on a coat of white spray paint. And then for the underside and legs, I used a coat of black matte spray paint. Both of these paints are just what I had handy. I'm not sure I'd recommend them. I doubt the colors are screen accurate. With the spray paint dry, I masked off the parts that needed to stay white on the body, and then I used an airbrush to paint all the red bits. I also put a coat of gunmetal silver over the black. These are all acrylic paints. Here I'm peeling off the masking tape and realizing how much I need to touch up by hand. So that's what I'm doing here. I also add a coat of gunmetal gray to the inner ring and glue it to the top half of Lola. The little white pegs shown here are just for alignment, and they get removed once the glue sets. Here I'm painting the underside of the top half silver. You shouldn't be able to see this once everything's assembled, but I did this just in case. Next I'm painting the details of the main body. It's now that I'm wishing I had 3D printed it in resin. The little tracks on the body were printed kind of rough. Note for next time. Some of the details I painted silver, some I painted gold. I took my cues here from Prop Shop on YouTube. This is how she painted Lola. I'll also include a link to this in the notes for the video. After I painted the body, I hit it with a couple of coats of satin finish. Next up, circuit boards. Whenever Lola lifts her wings, you get a peek at her electronics. Droid Division includes some fake PCBs in their files for this. Here I'm painting them. I'm not referencing anything, just kind of making it up as I go. I tend to thin my paint quite a bit, so I ended up doing a couple passes on these things. Once they were painted, I gave them a couple coats of the same matte finish I put on the body. With the body painted, it was time to turn my attention to the stand. Droid Division includes a basic stand in their set of files, but I needed something to accommodate a push button, power plug, and some wiring, so I decided to design a custom stand, inspired somewhat by the Droid Division stand. Push button shown here is a cheap 19mm switch I got off of eBay. It has a blue LED ring that's the same color as the LEDs I plan to use in Lola's body. I'm just taking some measurements so my custom stand has places for these things. Simple 5.5mm power jack. I got a bunch of these from Amazon. I'm using Fusion 360 here from Autodesk. The top bit of this is very similar to Droid Division stand. It's just the base that's really different. I added appropriately sized holes for the electronics, as well as some lettering and a Rebel Alliance insignia on the front for fun. I'm doing much of the same process here as I did with Lola's body. 80 grit sanding, glue things up that need gluing, filler primer, 120 grit sanding, 220 grit sanding, 400 grit wet sanding, and then a couple thin coats of primer. In this case, I wanted to go for a glossy look on the base, so I went a step further and did a pass of very light wet sanding with 1000 grit. I had this black glossy enamel spray paint sitting around, so I went with that. With that dry, next up was painting the Rebel logo. I used a red acrylic. The letters were done in white. I thinned down some white acrylic in a little squeeze bottle that had a needle applicator. Just kind of squirted it in. I've seen people get good results using fingernail polish for this kind of thing. And despite living with 3 women, there was no white fingernail polish in the house, so acrylic would have to do. This was another time I regretted printing with filament, as the letters were really rough on the inside edges. Finally, I sprayed everything down with a gloss finish. Now it was time to assemble. I start with the eye lens holders, just using some super glue. Brackets for the wings, making sure I got the right orientation. And then the 2 halves of the body. You'll notice I'm a bit schizophrenic when it comes to super glue versus epoxy. I use epoxy here just because I have a lot more of it. Here I'm gluing the legs. Let's talk LEDs. These LEDs come from Elegoo. They come in a pack of assorted colors. I got them on Amazon. The best thing about them is that they come pre-wired with a current limiting resistor. You can make out its shape underneath that heat shrink tubing. Given how lazy I am, I couldn't pass these things up. Here I'm just testing out the brightness with different voltages. The LEDs are rated for 12 volts. There's really not a noticeable difference in brightness, at least from my perspective, between the 12 volts and 9 volts. Here I'm hot gluing an LED into the main eye. I run the wiring out the hole in the back, and then I hot glue the eye into the main body. Next was the smaller eye. Same thing, I hot glue the LED in, run the wiring through the same hole in the back. For the smaller eye lens, I found some 14mm glass domes on eBay. And here's where I'm making a mistake. I'm using super glue to hold the lens. The super glue holds it just fine, but it completely clouds up the lens. It's not the end of the world. It kind of acts as a diffuser in a way, but I gotta remember not to use super glue on anything. I want to stay transparent. For the master lens, I used a clear Christmas tree ornament I found at Hobby Lobby. I just measured the diameter of the opening and cut a similar size from the bulb, and then I glued it with epoxy. I'd eventually like to find a more durable solution. Now I'm just putting the circuit boards back in. I don't actually glue these, they hang loose. And now the wings, also not glued in. With everything painted and mostly assembled, I could finally start wiring things up. The power adapter I'm using is 5 volts. It has a 5.5 millimeter barrel connector. The first thing I wanted to do was figure out the polarity of the pins on the plug. So I just plugged it in and used my multimeter to figure out what's what. Soldered appropriately colored wires so I wouldn't forget. And then a little heat shrink tubing here for good measure. And then it was a simple matter of installing it into the base. The switch I found on eBay, it has 5 pins, which threw me for a loop at first, but I figured it out in the end. Well, the LED and the switch actually has to be wired up separately. So. This is just me testing the LED out on the switch. Before I got too much further, I wanted to install the rod that will support Lola on the stand. So when I initially designed the stand, I had intended to 3D print a plastic rod, but as I thought about it, I got nervous because of Lola's weight. So I found a 9mm aluminum rod on Amazon for $10. It was almost 10 inches long, which is too long for what I needed. So I took a few quick measurements and then I cut it down to size. Filed down any sharp edges. What's not shown here is me gluing the rod into place. I just used 2-part epoxy. I don't entirely expect the rod to stay put forever. So I added a bunch of epoxy on the inside underneath the rod to keep it from sliding through. Next, I fed the wires through the aluminum tube that'll connect to Lola. At this point, I'm really done with the inside of the base, so I'm ready to close it up. I found some sticky feet that I bought, who knows where and who knows when. I put them on the base lid and then screwed it into place. Next, I'm ready to connect the wires to Lola. I take off the wings so they don't get in my way. I soldered the wires together and then used a little heat shrink tubing on the joints. And with that, I put a little epoxy around the rim of the aluminum rod, and then settled Lola down in her permanent spot. What you don't see here is that I wedged a bunch of paper towels under her feet to get her level. And after the glue set, I added the wings back, and I was done.